Hello, podcast listeners from around the world, and thank you for tuning into the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast today. I'm your host, Jordan River. As always, I want to thank you for tuning in to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Before we get started, as always, I urge you to spread the show. Real cool listeners of the show, spread the show and tell a friend. So do just that. Find us on Spotify, find us on iTunes, anywhere you can find podcasts, and tell a friend about the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast, maybe about today's episode. It is a solo episode. It is a coffee history episode. This one kind of came out of left field, and the more that I started to dig into the research and write the script, the more in love with this topic that I became. I love exploring these rich coffee-producing regions and finding out more about their history and how coffee played a role there. I think that this may be the new focus as we continue coffee history worldwide. But today, we're headed to Southeast Asia. We're headed somewhere very unique and very exotic, somewhere I've had the pleasure of spending some time. I'm talking about Indonesia. That's right, Indonesia. Lying between the southeastern Asian mainland and the continental island of Australia is Indonesia, a series of large islands that make up the largest country in Southeast Asia. It is stunningly beautiful and unique in Indonesia. They've got their own unique culture. On the island of Bali, they even have their own unique religion. And it's home to over 100 endangered species of animals. Not to mention, it's an incredible place to cultivate coffee. So brew up a nice cup of Java and have a seat as I take you on a journey to explore the rich history that is Indonesian coffee. Now let's start by a recap on Java and a recap on the Dutch and the East India Trading Co. To catch us up on previous coffee histories, and I do recommend that you go back and listen to every lovely episode of Coffee History, the coffee production in Java and the Dutch influence there become a very, very big turning point for coffee as a whole. You see, as we stated in previous episodes, the Dutch East India Trading Company, or known then as the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, did my best there. The VOC was trying to break the Arabic monopoly on worldwide coffee production. Again, if you tune into those older episodes, coffee only came from Arabia and Ethiopia. That was it. And the Dutch were looking to break that monopoly and blow coffee out worldwide. So in the 17th century, when Indonesia was still under Dutch occupation, the VOC brought Arabica coffee plants to Indonesia, and specifically Java. Quote, the Dutch colonial government initially planted coffee around Batavia, it's Jakarta today, and as far south as Sukabumi and Bogor. Coffee plantations were later established in East Java, Central Java, West Java, and in parts of Sumatra. Large areas of forested land were cleared and cultivated specifically for the development of these plantations. The growth of coffee plantations was responsible for the development of a lot of the infrastructure in Central Java during the turn of the 19th century. Roads and railways were needed to transport coffee beans from the island interior to the ports where the coffee was loaded on ships and exported. End quote. So the coffee trade literally shaped the land of Indonesia. Now, the Dutch weren't the only world power to be playing here. This is important to note. The Portuguese had also imported Arabica coffee plants, but they were from a different root stock than what the Dutch had imported and weren't as prevalent at the time, is my understanding. But this import of coffee to Indonesia was the beginning of something massive. Indonesia turned into a huge coffee exporter. The Dutch East India Company exported the first Indonesian coffees in 1711. Over time, this export increased to 60 tons of coffee every single year. The coffee plantations in Indonesia became the first outside of Arabia and Ethiopia, and as a result, the VOC managed to dominate the world coffee trade from about 1725 all the way to 1780. The Indonesian coffees were very famous back in Europe, and the folks called the black drink a cup of Java. Until the mid-19th century, Javanese coffee belonged among some of the best coffees in the world. Now, Arabica is the cultivar that was being grown there on Indonesia at the time. Delicious, fine Arabica beans. And it ruled, as it still does today, for those who are coffee connoisseurs. But in Indonesia, its rule didn't last long as the majority. Enter the coffee leaf rust epidemic of the late 1800s. Near the turn of the 19th century, a huge portion of the coffee plantations in Indonesia, as well as Sri Lanka and Malaysia, were devastated by coffee rust. We've done an entire exploration on this fungal pest known as coffee rust that to this day destroys billions of dollars worth of coffee with ease and pleasure. Coffee rust, or also known as Hemilia vestartrix, did my best there too. Coffee rust is a fungus, and it creates a fine yellow orange-like powder on the undersides of leaves and plants, and this fungus spreads very quickly and wipes out entire plantations. It devastated the colonial coffee industry of Indonesia. Java was actually hit the worst at this time due to a combination of climate and the specific root stock that they were working with there. After the devastation of the coffee leaf rust, some plantation owners didn't replant coffee, but opted instead for things like tea or rubber trees, which they felt were less prone to these types of fungal diseases. Many of these rubber plantations still remain in operation today. But the Dutch and the Indonesian coffee farmers weren't ready to give up on coffee altogether. Instead of growing the delicious but finicky Arabica species, they opted to try different coffee cultivars and see if they could survive the rust onslaught. The Dutch then brought coffee Liberica to Indonesia. This is a different species of coffee, and it was introduced in 1875 after the leaf rust epidemic's worst wave. Now, this type of coffee, Liberica, was not favored. The taste was too acidic, and it wasn't as super resistant to the rust as they wanted to. However, the Liberica cherry can still be found throughout Java because of this import in 1875, but it's seldom used as a commercial crop. After the Liberica trial, the Dutch colonial government then opted for the more resistant Robusta variety to replant the affected plantations. This breed of coffee turned out to be the most resistant to leaf rust. Besides, maintenance is less and the production is much higher. Robusta coffee rapidly expanded and replaced Arabica beans in areas where the altitude was low, and that's where coffee rust really thrives. So Robusta spread throughout Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, and beyond. This Robusta introduction was the key to the coffee industry surviving the rust wave, and Robusta still makes up 90% of the coffee crops in Indonesia today. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here and talk about Robusta. As you know, you've heard on this show, there is this stigma, there is this conception, and there's a lot of truth to it. Robusta is the lower quality commercial bean, so they say, and Arabica is the higher quality, finer bean, so they say. But I really want to challenge that. In my opinion, I think that they're just two different varieties. Let's talk about Robusta and what makes it different. As we've said in previous episodes, Robusta is higher in caffeine. It has almost 2 times the caffeine as some Arabica species. It's higher in certain levels of plant phenols. It's higher in pyrazines, which is a contributor to aromatic notes. It's resistant to molds and mildews and rust, as we said. It's easier to grow, less maintenance. And because of that, Robusta gets farmed as kind of a mass production crop. It's treated like an inferior bean because it is easier to grow and it's being grown at a massive scale. But as we said, certain compounds of healthy chemicals are actually higher in Robusta. That's why I like working with Purity Coffee, because they actually take the time to do tests like this and do explorations that really no one otherwise would do. I would like to see tests done on organically, regeneratively farmed Robusta and see what levels come out of those beans. And like Purity was doing with their health-specific blends, if we find that maybe a certain species of Robusta is high in trigonylene, and trigonylene is good for, let's just say, for instance, dementia, maybe we can start to formulate some health-specific blends incorporating Robusta, the less quality bean, so to speak, but actually farming it well, farming it under craft circumstances, and then incorporating it into a healthy coffee. I guess what I'm saying is Robusta has been kind of, demonized and segregated to the low quality bean, but there's more there to it than we know. Don't sleep on Robusta just because it is the mass-produced crop. It is still coffee, and there's so much research and exploration to be done behind the science of this incredible species of coffee bean. But back to Indonesia and their coffee farming and their taste for Arabica. Is the Arabica all gone? Well, we said that, 90% of the crops in Indonesia today are Robusta, but you can still find the highest quality of Arabicas. What did they do? Well, the Arabica farmers simply moved to higher ground. Coffee leaf rust does not like heights. Arabica coffee can survive at an altitude of 1,000 meters up or more. So nowadays, you'll find Arabica coffee still being farmed in Indonesia, but it's in the Javanese highlands, like the Lian Plateau in East Java, or the upper slopes of Sumatra. So they moved to these higher area places in Indonesia, or those were the ones that survived and stuck around while growing Arabica, and the coffee leaf rust doesn't make it up that high. Very, very interesting. And of course, this leads to still legendary Arabica coffees being produced in Sumatra today, in Indonesia today. Perhaps your favorite Sumatran blend, again, a high altitude Arabica to avoid that coffee leaf rust. And we're going to get into that Sumatran coffee in just a moment to wrap up the show. But first, I do want to just touch on an interesting piece of history before we conclude. As we move through our coffee timeline, exiting the late 1800s into the 1900s and approaching the World Wars, you see, I was extremely fascinated to find that World War II and the struggle for Indonesian independence actually played a huge part in subsequent changes to the Indonesian coffee market. You see, plantations were taken over briefly by the occupying Japanese in World War II. Now, growing up, they didn't teach us anything about the Pacific Theater, but Japan did indeed occupy Indonesia, and many colonial plantation owners fled the country to avoid being arrested. Now, after the Japanese left, plantations throughout Indonesia came back under the control of the new government or were just outright abandoned. This led to a dissolving of the coffee power structure in Indonesia and put the land back into the hands of small farmers and cooperatives, to where it still exists today. Even to this day, close to 92% of coffee production in Indonesia is in the hands of small farmers or cooperatives. So fascinating, so unique, and a direct result of the occupation and then the leaving of the Japanese military. So fascinating that those effects are still lingering today. I'd like to finish this episode by citing an article from Stockton Graham where they talk about Sumatran coffee. And this is kind of the whole point of these explorations, to both understand the history of these coffee farming regions and their cultures, but also to immerse ourselves into the magical attributes of the coffee bean itself as it hails from these very distinct and exotic lands. Quote, "Coffees from Sumatra, the westernmost island in Indonesia, have a distinct bluish color at the green bean stage, which is attributed to a lack of iron in the soil. Their tastes can often be considered smooth, with a sweet body that is balanced and intense. Depending on the region, or blend of regions, the flavors of the land and processing can also be very pronounced. Part of this is due to the unique wet hulling technique used during processing in Indonesia. Another factor in the diverse and intriguing nature of Sumatra coffee is the large number of small producers. Even today, close to 92% of production is in the hands of small farmers or cooperatives. In 2016, Indonesia ranked 4th in the world with an estimated export total of 400,000 tons of coffee. Less than 14% of that is Arabica from northern Sumatra, which makes it a very desirable and often hard to find coffee. End quote. So I have a feeling the next time you brew up that Sumatran Java, you may have a different overall experience, now knowing the incredible rich history that went into that mug of coffee, along with the countless amount of blood, sweat, and tears. I hope you enjoyed this very unique exploration today. I know as I was writing this, I just got more and more excited, so I'm sure you learned something, and I do hope that you had a lovely time exploring with me. We'll be back with more coffee history, more interviews, more health and science, and of course, coffee. That's all for today. Jordan River signing off, saying have an extraordinary day, everybody. We'll see you next time on the CHSP.